Okay, in this final part of lecture two, we're going to be talking about the origins of gender stereotypes. Where do they come from? Do they have their origin in traditional gender roles, assigning women as caretakers and men as providers, or do they have something to do with the gender status hierarchy? So perhaps you've noticed the dualities of gender. Gender researchers have labeled gender stereotypes with these terms: agentic for men, communal for women. That's the one that I tend to stick with. Sometimes people call it competence versus warmth. Sometimes people call it instrumental, meaning men are more able to affect their desires, to actualize their desires. They have they're more instrumental in the causes of what happens versus being expressive, particularly verbally and emotionally. However you label it, they all boil down to a similar dimension, which is men are for doing and women are for caring, or women are for feeling, if you prefer. It's a really laughably simplistic dichotomy or binary that describes no person alive, but it's frequently endorsed. So where does it come from? Alice Akeley's answer with social role theory is the traditional assignment of men to the provider role and women to caretaking roles. So you'll recall this slide. Men are more ambitious, dominant, rational, competent, powerful, able, in a word, agentic. Women are more supportive, loving, kind, sensitive, helpful, nicer, in a word, communal. So the question we're asking is, to what extent do these stereotypic traits reflect gender roles? So to test that, Hoffman and Hurst, back in 1990, did a study. What they did is they varied the roles played by two different groups within an alien civilization, different planet. Orinthians were described as city workers, and Acmeans were described as child raisers. So why did they use fictional groups? Because it was the case that they could sort of strip these groups of any prior assumptions in order to test whether social roles are sufficient. Is that enough to produce what we know of as agentic versus communal gender stereotypes, even though nothing is said about gender? For all we know, these alien groups don't have gender as we think of gender, but they do have different role assignments. So participants read descriptions of 15 members of each group that listed each individual's name, the role they'd been assigned, as well as their personality traits. So for example, Demorian is an Orinthian who works in the city and is individualistic, warm, and creative. So note that their personalities were androgynous, meaning equally male and female, because every individual was described with one masculine, one feminine, and one gender-neutral trait, so that the only thing that distinguished between the two groups was whether they worked in the city or whether they raised children. And what did Hoffman and Hurst find? They found that that trait information, although it was androgynous, well, it was completely ignored. Orinthians, or the city workers, were rated as the more agentic group, while Acmeans, the child raisers, were seen as more communal. In other words, they found that roles and deeds seemed to cause gender-like stereotypes. Well, what about status? So Conway and her colleagues, about 6 years later, they used a similar strategy, but this time they're describing two primitive tribes on Earth, the Bwisi and the Mwenge. But this time the focus was on status difference, not so much role. So one group was said to have better housing, their clothes were better, more elaborate, and they had access to special foods. They also ran the religious ceremonies. Participants rated the high status group as more agentic and the low status group as more communal. Again, nothing was said about gender. So Status also causes gender stereotypes. Status differences create this idea that some groups are more agentic, some groups are more communal. Why? People assume that high status groups have more agency than low status groups because the low status groups sort of have to accommodate the dominant members by being more ingratiating, right? They're being nicer and more cooperative. Remember, we just talked about smiling, right? Why is it demanded of women that we smile even when we're not feeling like it, even to strangers, right? It's because we're supposed to be more ingratiating. So if there are these two causes of gender stereotypes, both status and roles, can we discern which one matters most? Well, in real life, tough to do that because gender roles and status are overlap, right? Men's provider roles are paid, whereas women's caretaking roles are either unpaid or they earn less money. So it's tough to disentangle the roles from the status implications. And as a result of this overlap, gender becomes a diffuse status characteristics. That's the terminology that sociologists tend to use. And what it really means is it's a cue to how much status you have. It lends men more authority than women just by being men. However, today, the majority of women work outside the home, and they make up almost half of the U.S. labor force. Plus, as I said, during World War II, women proved themselves more than capable of performing men's jobs. So if social roles are the key cause of gender stereotypes, then the sea change in our society, with women moving into the workplace, should have triggered sea changes in gender stereotypes, both during World War II and after the 1950s into the 60s and 70s when women again entered the workforce. Instead, gender stereotypes haven't changed very much at all. If we can call this like a natural experiment, we can say that the role of gender roles doesn't seem to have much to do with stereotypes because they haven't changed. What has changed is that compared with back in the 1970s, women themselves do rate themselves as more agentic than women did in the 1970s. But the stereotypes, they haven't budged. Although there is one change, women and men are now viewed as equally competent, right? Meaning it's not the case that men are thought to be sort of naturally more intelligent than women, at least not in national samples within the United States. But it's still the case that what they're good at is thought to differ. So this idea of male agency and female communality is a stubborn duality. Of course, Alice Eagly will point out that women have continued to serve as the primary caregivers, even while employed full-time, even while they are professionals with high-powered careers, right? They're still doing most of the domestic labor in the home and most of the child raising. And so she says, rightly, that gender roles are still implicated in gender stereotypes. But just how powerful is the gender status quo? Well, to answer that question, we must first find out the overlap between gender stereotypes and status characteristics. In other words, when we look at these agentic and communal traits, we have to ask to what extent are they linked to status, high status and low status. So I'm going to drag you back in your memory to recall that gender stereotypes do not merely describe men and women, but also prescribe, like a pharmacist would prescribe, what they should be, and importantly, what they should not be, and we call those proscriptions. So prescriptions are gender ideals and prescriptions are gender transgressions. And together they form what I call the gender rules. And we know that those gender rules differ for men and women, but nobody until I did this study had bothered to find out to what extent they're linked to status. So to find out, we need to measure the extent to which gender stereotypic traits are linked to people with high status or linked to people with low status when nothing is said about gender. And we also need to independently measure how much each trait is considered an ideal or a transgression for each gender. And then we'll see which of these gender rules overlap with status ratings. So my colleagues and I created a list of 64 well-known stereotypic traits, and then we asked 800 Rutgers undergraduates, half of them were guys, to complete one of 4 surveys. The traits were always the same in each survey, but the instructions differed by condition, like so. For each trait below, indicate how desirable it is in American society for a woman to possess each of the following characteristics on a scale from 1, not at all desirable, to 9, very desirable. And then if you were in a different condition, we took out woman and we replaced it with man. And then the third group of subjects indicated how common or typical you think each of the following characteristics are in someone who has low status on a scale from 1, not at all typical, to 9, very typical. Or in the fourth condition, low status was replaced with high status. And then because different samples completed for different surveys, the results should be relatively free of context effects and demand. And demand is really big. Like when you ask people to cough up their gender stereotypes, they can do it. They know how the culture thinks about men and women, and they basically oblige on demand, right? So it's important to do that. And if you have context effects, just means that, responding to how typical or how desirable something is for women could cloud or make your responses to how something is typical or desirable of a man, it kind of leaks into it and contaminates your answer, right? So you've got context effects and demand, and we try to get rid of all that by having people fill out a separate survey depending on the condition. So how do we score the stereotypes? If a trait was rated a 6 or higher, remember they're 9-point scales, it was judged to be prescriptive, something ideal for either men or women. For example, leadership ability was highly desirable for men, that's almost an 8 on a 9-point scale, but much less so for women, about a 6 on a 9-point scale, resulting in a very healthy, moderate-sized effect. If the trait was rated a 4 or lower, it was judged to be prescriptive, right? A thou shalt not. For example, gullible was perceived as highly undesirable for men, about a 3 on a 9-point scale, but less undesirable for women, about a 5 on a 9-point scale, resulting in, again, a moderate effect size. This time, women have more permission than men have to be gullible. So first I'm going to show you the gender rules, what men and women should and shouldn't be, and then I'll show you the overlap between the rules and status characteristics. Each list is ranked so that the largest gender differences appear at the top. So I kind of think of this as, I'm dating myself, but Dave Letterman used to have the top 10 of something, something, right? So this is more like the top 10, 12, or in some cases a little bit more. So these are the positive traits that each sex is valued for. Gender ideals are, if you look at the men's side, you're seeing a lot of overlap between those lists that I've been showing you, right? Competitive, career-oriented, assertive, independent, leadership ability, right? These are what you would call male agency. And then on the women's side, you're seeing definitely some communality, interested in children, sensitive to others' needs, warm, cooperative, supportive, polite, right? Women are nice kind of thing, right? But there's some other things that women have to be as well, like cheerful, enthusiastic, remember, smiling, friendly. So, and they have to attend to their appearance. Very important, ladies, that we care about what we look like. And here are the gender transgressions. So men's are emotional, naive, weak, insecure, gullible. melodramatic, uncertain, moody, indecisive, superstitious, and jealous. And women's are aggressive, intimidating, dominating, arrogant, demanding, angry, ruthless, controlling, cold towards others, self-centered, and cynical. Okay, so now what did we do with the status surveys? For all 64 traits, we compared how typical each one was seen for high status people versus low status people using, see if you can remember, what a t-test is. And what we found is that 50 out of the 64 traits had significant status differences, right? So that's like, find me a stereotype that doesn't have status implication. Hard to do. There were only about 14. But then how do those map onto the gender roles? So in this slide, the key is yellow is high status, blue is low status, white is neutral status. So you look at men's and you see that they're like all yellow, meaning men's gender prescriptions are high in status. What about women's communality? There's a low status, there's a neutral, low, high status, high status. Cooperative is neutral in status, friendly, supportive, attends to appearance. Well, that's something high status people do more than, I guess, bums. And then polite, which is neutral in status. So there's not a lot here to suggest that women's prescription to be communal has anything to do with status. Super interesting. That was a big surprise because we expected communal traits to be low in status. They weren't. On average, they were status neutral. But then what about prescriptions, what people should not be? And that's where the genders mirror each other in ways that shows a reverse status. So on the male side, almost all of what they shouldn't be is low in status. There's a couple of gender status neutral traits like moody and superstitious, but for the most part, what men cannot be is low in status. And then you see the flip side of that is what women can't be is high in status. Only one of women's prescriptions is low in status, and that's angry. Cynical is gender neutral. Everything else, these are high status traits that are reserved for men and reserved for leaders. Women can't go there. So what men should be is high in status. What they cannot be is low in status. What women should be doesn't have anything to do with status, but what they can't be is high in status. Again, those traits are reserved for leaders and for men. Because gender transgressions are likely to be strongly policed, it helps explain why women face more challenges than men when they go after leadership. Women's challenges may stem more from the status implications of their gender more than from traditional gender roles. After all, women today can have and do have careers, they become professionals, but when they strive to become leaders, when they strive to be top dog, then they risk backlash. Women in power is a discomforting combination. Actual female leaders are turned into monsters, depriving them of their femininity, or they are hyper-feminized to the point of being sexually objectified, treated like sex objects, right? So some examples are, this is Margaret Thatcher. She was the first female prime minister of Britain, and this is a Google image of her. They used to call her in the press Attila the Hen. And Hillary Clinton, of course, so many demonized images of her. This is Condoleezza Rice. She worked for President Bush in a couple of national security capacities. Here she is as a devil on a cake. And then to show sexual objectification, I couldn't find anything from Margaret Thatcher, but she was considerably older, so maybe that's a good time of in a woman's life to be a leader. At least, you'll just be a monster. You won't be a sex object. I first started to notice this when I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, and Hillary Clinton was the first lady. Bill Clinton was president, and he had her head up the commission to reform healthcare. He wanted something like Medicare for all, right? What's called the public option for healthcare. Gave her a lot of power, right? But I was stunned by a Spy magazine cover, which took a classic image of Marilyn Monroe in a classic film called Bus Stop, with her skirt up, and then she's standing over a subway, and then turned it into Hillary's big secret, right? Which you can see for yourself. I was just appalled by that. I was like, oh, if a woman has power, then somehow she has to actually have switched genders. A lot of people have, smeared her with the idea that she's a lesbian. So, And then if you miss the message from Spy, here it is again. What Hillary problem? She's got a whip and she's a dominatrix, right? So David Remnick, he's a writer for the New Yorker. He calls this political pornography, whereby, quote, powerful women get their comeuppance. Powerful women pose a direct threat or challenge to the patriarchy, right? Which can make people so uncomfortable they resort to sexual derogation. And that can take the form of branding powerful women as castrating bitches and ball busters. This is still popularly sold. Many websites called the Hillary Nutcracker. It came out when she first ran for president in 2008. Ranges from that to stigmatizing them as sluts and whores. Consider, recent example, how conservatives are smearing Kamala Harris. So Rush Limbaugh, a lot of my students don't know who he is. He received the Medal of Freedom for his role in helping to get Donald Trump elected president. He's a right-wing media pundit who has a talk show, or hate talk radio show. It's ranked as the second most popular in the U.S., right behind Sean Hannity. When Kamala Harris was announced as Joe Biden's running mate, Rush Limbaugh branded her as a whore, called her a mattress, and falsely claimed she slept her way to the top. The result, we now have what has been called Joe in the Hoe. It's a slogan being sold on merchandise, from T-shirts to cups and caps, right? And you can see that they've taken this graphic from the Biden-Harris slogan and they plaster it in Joe in the Hoe all over. It's all over everything. Amazon was selling it, but then there was a outrage from the public and they stopped almost immediately. Well, the media does not help the situation. Powerful women in film and on TV are often portrayed as cold, neurotic, psychologically imbalanced, or corrupt and dangerous. And that conditions or coaxes people to feel really uncomfortable when a woman is in charge, right? We don't have great role models for people to point to say, oh, remember that series, Hada Hada Hada, somebody had great, no. Or some, a woman was a president and she was fantastic. Madam Secretary is about the only TV series that I can think of off the top of my head that portrays a woman with power. She's a Secretary of State. She's just, of course, gorgeous. And she's wonderful. Tia Leone plays her. But check out the merchandise sold at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland back in 2016 when Hillary was running against Donald Trump as the first woman to ever be nominated for the presidency on a major party ticket, Democratic. Trump, of course, running as a Republican. And you can pause the movie here and just take it in if you haven't seen some of these before. But you can see that, she's a bitch, she's a tramp, she's easy sexually. It's just horrible. It was bad in 2008, but in 2016, I tell you, the gloves were off. And with all that lock her up chant, I kept thinking, yeah, you want to lock her into gender prison. And then my favorite biblical verse is feminists are sluts, which is, I'm sure, not Proverbs 5:5, but that was also popular at the RNC. So what we start to see is how sex and sexism go together. sex, sexual abuse, when it's used like as a weapon against female authority, it really indicates how very much sex plays a role in sexism. Calling ambitious women sluts, ball busters, castrating bitches, really reflects how much men are expected to dominate women, whether it's politically, economically, or sexually. So the way I think about it is sexual equality is like the missing link in the quest for gender equality. Women have made all kinds of strides, all kinds of progress in the workplace, less so in the home, but it's getting better. It's just, sexual equality seems to be the elusive missing link. If female sexuality had the same priority as male sexuality, we wouldn't have sexual double standards that boost men's status while stigmatizing women for the same sexual behaviors. They wouldn't exist because people would be like celebrating female sexuality the same way they celebrate male sexuality. And also, powerful women wouldn't be derogated using sexualized slurs, suggesting they aren't real women. They must be some kind of masculinized woman. So they must be bad women if they're not real women. They're ball busters, bitches, or sluts. And that's the end of lecture 2. So don't forget to bring your comments to class on Wednesday or email them to me. Thank you for your attention.